I was not banned from the party over a lack of seats. I was crossed off because my family needed a perfect picture rather than a living truth. My sister made one mistake posting that photo too early and too confidently. Just hours later, I realized they were not merely removing me from a table. They were quietly erasing me from the legacy my money kept alive. I stopped begging for love and started keeping score. My name is Vivian Greenwood. At 34 years of age, I have built a life defined by the quiet, unglamorous virtue of endurance. I work as a senior contract risk manager at Blackwater Freight Systems in Raleigh. My daily existence revolves around identifying liabilities, anticipating failures, and sealing loopholes before they can bleed a company dry. I live alone in an impeccably organized apartment where everything has its designated place, largely because I have spent my entire life trying to figure out where exactly I fit. People in my profession are paid to be disciplined, to strip emotion from the equation, and to look at the worst-case scenario without blinking. But long before Blackwater Freight Systems gave me a title and a corner office, my family had already trained me for the role. I have always been the reliable one. I am the daughter you call when a crisis needs managing, a bill needs paying, or a mess needs quietly sweeping under the rug. I am not, however, the daughter you call when you want to feel loved. The phone rang on a Tuesday evening, shattering the quiet of my living room. The caller ID flashed the name of my mother, Colleen Greenwood. I let it ring twice, taking a steadying breath before answering. My mother does not call to chat. She calls to deploy information. "Vivian." "Darling," Colleen said, her voice dripping with the kind of practiced, honeyed warmth she usually reserved for the country club board. "I am just calling to finalize the headcount for the anniversary dinner this weekend." I leaned back against the kitchen counter, tracing the grout line between the tiles with my thumbnail. "I sent my RSVP 2 weeks ago, Mom." "I am coming." A sharp, deliberate sigh crackled through the receiver. "Well, that is the thing, sweetheart. Your father and I have been looking at the space at the River Club. You know how notoriously tight that terrace is. We are having to make some incredibly difficult cuts to the guest list. We really want to keep it strictly to the people we are truly close with right now. You understand? Do you not? We just want a very intimate, stress-free evening." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the unspoken truth hanging in the air. I was her flesh and blood, yet I did not meet the criteria for being truly close. I was being uninvited from my parents' 35th wedding anniversary. The blow did not land like a shock. It did not knock the wind out of me or leave me gasping for air. Instead, it settled into my chest like a delayed confirmation of a diagnosis I had known about for years. The rejection was wrapped in silk, delivered with a soft, apologetic lilt, but it cut just as deep as a serrated blade. "I understand," I replied. My voice was entirely even, devoid of the hurt she might have been anticipating or perhaps hoping for. "I hope you and Dad have a beautiful evening. You are always so reasonable, Vivian." "Thank you," she said, and the relief in her tone was palpable. She hung up before I could say another word. I placed the phone face down on the marble counter. Exactly 12 minutes later, the screen illuminated with a text message. It was from my younger sister, Marin Greenwood. "Do not overthink it. Mom just wants things really light and easy this weekend. Let us catch up soon." I stared at the glowing letters until they blurred. Marin always had a talent for disguising cruelty as compassion. On the surface, her message read like a gentle reassurance from a caring sibling. But I knew the translation. I spoke the fluent, toxic language of the Greenwood family. What Marin was actually saying was, "You do not belong in this frame anymore. You ruin the aesthetic." Closing my eyes, I felt the familiar weight of childhood memories pressing down on my chest. Marin had always been the golden child, the one who effortlessly played the role of the sweet, affectionate daughter. She was all sunshine and dramatic embraces, painting a perfect picture of familial devotion whenever there was an audience. I, on the other hand, was the sturdy foundation they walked all over. I was the child who was expected to be understanding, to know how to yield, and to keep my mouth shut. I remembered a dozen different family dinners where the dynamic was so clearly drawn, it might as well have been carved into the mahogany table. If I brought home a flawless report card or won a state debate championship, my parents would offer a brisk nod. My achievements were treated as a baseline obligation. They were expected. But if Marin crashed a car into a mailbox or failed out of a college semester, the entire house would mobilize to coddle her. Her failures were tragically labeled as a difficult phase. She received grace, hugs, and endless second chances, while I received nothing but a quiet expectation to fix whatever she had broken. A specific memory flared in my mind, burning bright and agonizing. I was 13 years old, standing in the shadows at the end of the long hallway in our old house. My parents were hosting a dinner party. I listened to my mother holding court in the dining room, her voice carrying over the clinking of crystal glasses. She spent 20 minutes gushing about Marin to the guests, praising her bright spirit and her beautiful smile. Not once did she mention my name. I had stood there in the dark, wondering if I was invisible, wondering what I had to do to earn a fraction of that glowing pride. I opened my eyes, the Raleigh skyline glittering coldly outside my apartment window. I forced myself to take a deep breath. I told myself I was no longer that 13-year-old girl standing at the end of the hallway, starved for affection and desperate for validation. I was a grown woman, independent and financially secure. Yet, the visceral, hollow feeling of being erased remained exactly the same. They were rewriting the narrative of their lives, and they had collectively decided to edit me out. Despite the heavy dread sitting in my stomach, the ingrained habit of being the dutiful daughter was hard to break. The evening before the anniversary party was scheduled to take place. I walked into a high-end boutique downtown and purchased a gift. It was a gesture of polite defiance, a way to prove to myself that I could maintain my dignity even when they stripped away theirs. I selected a heavy, luxurious, leather-bound photo album. I paid an exorbitant fee to have the cover custom engraved in gold lettering. The inscription read, 35 years, still standing. I packaged it beautifully with a muted silver ribbon and arranged for a private courier to deliver it directly to Greenwood House the following morning. It was an olive branch, or perhaps a mirror, daring them to look at the daughter they were actively ignoring. The morning of the party arrived with bright, mocking sunshine. I was sitting at my kitchen island, nursing a cup of black coffee and reviewing a dense liability contract for Blackwater Freight Systems. When the intercom buzzed, the concierge announced a delivery. Minutes later, a box was placed in my hands. It was the same box I had sent out hours earlier. I carried it to the table and carefully untied the silver ribbon. The leather album was inside, utterly untouched, pristine and rejected. Tucked beneath the heavy cover was a small piece of expensive, cream-colored stationery. I recognized my mother's elegant, sloping handwriting immediately. There was no greeting, no explanation, and no apology. There was only a single, ruthlessly composed sentence. We have already chosen the look for tonight. I read the words again, and then a third time. Oh. The message was so perfectly polite, so meticulously devoid of outright hostility, that its underlying brutality was staggering. They did not care about the gift. They did not care about the 35 years of history. They cared about the optics. I did not fit the aesthetic of the happy, unburdened family they intended to broadcast to their wealthy friends and business partners. I was too serious, too grounded in the harsh realities they preferred to ignore, and perhaps too much of a reminder of the debts they owed me. I set the cream-colored note down on the dark granite counter. I did not cry. The instinct to weep had been trained out of me a long time ago. Instead, a cold, crystalline clarity washed over me. The rejection was no longer a misunderstanding or a casual slight. It was a deliberate, calculated eviction. They had taken my money, my time, and my quiet compliance for years. And now they were shutting the door in my face simply because I did not match the decor. The silk wrapping had fallen away, and the knife was finally fully exposed. to the outside world. I was just a successful corporate woman who occasionally helped her parents manage their estate. That is the polite fiction we all maintained for the sake of cocktail party conversations. The reality, however, was far more clinical and deeply entrenched in the Greenwood family ecosystem. I was not considered a daughter. I was a redundant power grid. I was the emergency generator that kicked in automatically when the main lines failed, humming quietly and efficiently in the dark to keep the lights burning in the grand house upstairs. I did not just help my parents, for years. I had been the invisible scaffolding keeping their entire financial structure from collapsing into dust, the centerpiece of their portfolio, and the very anchor of their social identity was Greenwood House. It was a sprawling, historic estate down in Charleston, complete with sweeping verandas and centuries-old oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. Over a decade ago, they had converted it into a premier event venue, hosting high society weddings and exclusive corporate retreats. It was beautiful, prestigious, and quietly bleeding money. After the global shutdown a few years ago, the venue went entirely dark. The lavish weddings were canceled. The lucrative corporate retreats vanished. But the crushing overhead remained absolute. They nearly lost the property entirely. My parents were drowning, gasping for air in a sea of red ink. And it was not my sister who threw them a lifeline. It was me. I was the one who liquidated a significant portion of my own stock portfolio to cover the massive, overdue commercial property taxes. When the hazard insurance policy was 48 hours away from cancellation due to non-payment, my bank account provided the immediate funds to reinstate it. Worst of all was the bridge loan. My father had taken out a high-yield, short-term commercial loan to keep the operating accounts afloat, a desperate gamble with predatory interest rates. When the balloon payments came due, I was the one who quietly wired the money to cover 2 consecutive interest periods, saving the estate from immediate foreclosure and public ruin. None of this was ever discussed in stark, honest terms. In my family, we did not talk about debt, default, or foreclosure. We spoke strictly in elegant euphemisms. My mother liked to frame my massive financial interventions as a noble sacrifice for the bloodline. "We are keeping the assets safe for the next generation," she would say, sipping her tea as if I had merely watered her plants while she was on a brief vacation. It was a beautiful, dignified phrase designed to sanitize the ugly truth. The reality was that I was the only person in the family who could read a balance sheet without panicking, and the only one capable of bearing the crushing weight of their financial reality. My father, Patrick Greenwood, had perfected the art of staying out of it. He was a soft-spoken man, quick with a gentle smile and a reassuring pat on the shoulder. He cultivated a permanent aura of mild-mannered ignorance, retreating to his study with a thick biography whenever the conversation turned to ledgers, attorneys, or bank notices. For a long time, I mistook his silence for innocence. I thought he simply did not understand the gravity of the situation, believing that my mother shielded him from the stress. But as the years ground on, and the desperate wire transfers from my account became a regular necessity, I finally understood the architecture of his passivity. Silence, when maintained for decades in the face of exploitation, is not innocent. It is a highly effective form of complicity. He let me carry his burdens because it allowed him to keep his hands clean and his conscience artificially clear. And then there was Marin. If I was the underground generator, Marin was the polished brass fixture catching the light in the foyer. She meticulously curated the image of the devoted, ever-present daughter. Her social media feeds were an endless scroll of carefully filtered moments. She would post pictures of herself bringing artisanal lattes to my mother, or arranging fresh-cut hydrangeas in the grand parlor of Greenwood House. The captions were always dripping with saccharine gratitude about the importance of family and staying close to your roots. Yet, she practically vanished whenever the real work began. She never saw a demand letter from an angry vendor. She never sat on a 3-hour conference call with a tax attorney. She never negotiated a settlement or lost a night of sleep over a pending lawsuit. She reaped all the emotional rewards of being the good daughter while doing absolutely none of the heavy lifting. For years, I operated under a deeply flawed, childish assumption. I truly believed that if I just kept patching the holes in their sinking ship, if I just kept proving my irrefutable utility, they would eventually see my worth. I thought my relentless competence would eventually translate into their affection. I thought that by saving Greenwood House, I was securing my rightful place inside it. I was completely wrong. Families like mine do not learn to love the people who save them. They only learn one lesson when the water gets too high. You call Vivian. They did not see me as a person with my own needs, my own future, or my own breaking point. They saw me as an infinite, expendable resource. My closest colleague and fiercely loyal friend, June Mercer, diagnosed the rot in my family dynamic years before I was willing to admit it out loud. June and I worked in the same risk management department, which meant she had a professional radar for bad investments and parasitic relationships. One evening, after I had abruptly canceled our dinner plans to handle a chaotic legal dispute involving one of my parents' unpaid contractors, she cornered me in the company break room. "You have to stop," June had said, her voice dropping to an intense, urgent register. "They are bleeding you dry, Vivian. And the worst part is, they do not even hate you. They do not have enough emotional investment in you to hate you. They are just used to using you. You are a tool in their shed, and right now, you are letting them grind down your edges until there is nothing left." I had stood there, clutching my cold coffee cup, completely unable to form a rebuttal. I did not argue with her. I could not. The remark did not sting because it was a cruel exaggeration. It shattered me because it was a naked, indisputable fact. To them, my money and my labor were as freely available as tap water, and just as easily taken for granted. Which brings me to the day of the anniversary party, the day the silence was supposed to win again. When the morning sun broke over Raleigh, I woke up in my meticulously tidy apartment with a familiar, hollow ache sitting heavily in my chest. I went through the motions of my weekend routine with robotic precision. I brewed my coffee, went for a 5-mile run, and scrubbed my kitchen counters until they gleamed. I aggressively avoided looking at the clock, knowing exactly what was happening down in Charleston. By late afternoon, the caterers would be setting up the raw bar on the terrace. By early evening, the string quartet would be tuning their instruments in the foyer. And right around sunset, my parents would be raising a glass to 35 years of marriage, surrounded by people who had never paid a single utility bill for the roof over their heads. I sat on my sofa as the evening crept in, the apartment growing dark around me. I made a conscious, deliberate vow to myself in the quiet room. I was going to let it go. I was going to swallow the humiliation, maintain the high ground, and let the slight wash over me like water over a stone. I would not call. I would not complain. I would simply continue to exist in the peripheral, shadowy space they had so clearly assigned me. I told myself it was the mature choice. I told myself it was the only way to preserve whatever fractured semblance of a family we had left. That quiet, suffocating resignation was the final intention of the woman I used to be. It was the last, pathetic gasp of the obedient daughter who believed her own erasure was the necessary price of peace. I had no idea that within a few short hours, that compliant version of Vivian would be dead, and a much colder, sharper woman would take her place. The blue light of my smartphone cast a sterile, isolating glow across the dark expanse of my living room. It was 9 o'clock in the evening. The silence in my apartment was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I was lying on the sofa, mindlessly dragging my thumb across the glass screen, relying on a modern reflex to numb my brain and run down the clock on a night I was supposed to pretend did not exist. Then, the algorithm delivered the strike. My sister's post sat at the very top of my feed, freshly uploaded and demanding immediate attention. I stopped breathing. The image loaded with crystal, high-definition clarity. It was a wide shot taken on the expansive back terrace of the event venue. The grand glass doors of the conservatory perfectly framed the background. Standing shoulder to shoulder was my entire extended family. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and my parents stood anchored in the center, with Marin and her husband Gavin flanking them like proud sentinels. They were a vision of orchestrated, flawless perfection. Every single person in the frame was dressed in meticulously coordinating shades of cream, ivory, and champagne. It did not look like a genuine family gathering. It looked like a highly produced editorial spread for a luxury lifestyle magazine. They stood under the warm, amber glow of the expensive string lights, their hands raised, their fingers delicately pinching the thin stems of crystal flutes. Their smiles were blinding, perfectly synced for the camera lens. It was a flawless advertisement for unwavering loyalty and unbroken generational wealth. Beneath the glowing image sat the caption. It was a single sentence. It did not say anything about a private family gathering. It did not mention the limited seating or the intimate nature of the event that my mother had used as her weapon of exclusion. It was much sharper, much more deliberate, and entirely toxic. The people who always showed up for us. I read the words. Then I read them again. The air in my lungs turned to ice. A distinct, physical jolt snapped down my spine, hitting my nervous system like a raw electrical wire dropping into a puddle of water. That single sentence hit harder than the photograph itself. I stood up, frozen in the quiet shadows of my living room. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of that statement was breathtaking. I knew exactly what showing up looked like in the Greenwood family, because I was the only person who actually possessed the stamina to do it. Showing up was not wearing a custom cream-colored silk dress and holding a glass of imported French wine while a photographer counted down from 3. Showing up was quietly transferring $50,000 from a personal savings account on a random Tuesday mornings just so the payroll checks for the venue staff would not bounce. Showing up was spending 40 hours on the phone negotiating with aggressive commercial creditors while everyone else in that photograph was taking a leisure trip to the coast. I was the one who showed up in the most brutal, grueling, and financially devastating ways imaginable. The truth was not that they wanted to surround themselves with the people who showed up. The truth was that I was too authentic, too heavy with the undeniable reality of their survival, to be allowed inside the frame. They desperately wanted the benefits of my sacrifice without the visual, living reminder of their crushing dependence. My thumb hovered over the glowing screen. The initial wave of humiliation, the familiar, pathetic sting of being the unwanted. Cast-aside child evaporated instantly. It did not linger for more than a few seconds. It burned off like morning fog beneath a magnifying glass, replaced entirely by a sudden, terrifyingly calm surge of pure, concentrated rage. It was a controlled, efficient burn. I did not want to cry. I wanted to dissect. I placed 2 fingers on the glass and zoomed in on the photograph. I bypassed the perfect, practiced smiles of my parents. I scrolled past Marin's triumphant, tilted chin. I focused my attention strictly on the background, examining the minute details of the party I had literally funded but was explicitly forbidden to attend. Just behind my father's right shoulder, positioned perfectly so it would inevitably be caught in the background of every single professional photograph taken on that terrace, stood a large, custom-made wooden welcome board. It was elegant, inscribed with heavy gold foil lettering. I magnified the image until the pixels blurred slightly at the edges, but the logo stamped at the top of the board was unmistakable. It was the corporate crest for Greenwood Heritage Events, LLC. My stomach plummeted, and then immediately hardened into absolute stone. That was not just a decorative family monogram. That was the specific, legally binding corporate entity I had personally helped them establish years ago to shield their personal assets from massive venue liabilities. It was the exact legal name attached to the commercial bank accounts I had been artificially inflating with my own salary for years. Seeing it proudly displayed on that sign, positioned front and center at a so-called intimate family dinner, fundamentally shifted the context of the entire evening. This was not a sentimental anniversary party, A normal family does not display their limited liability company logo at a romantic milestone celebration. You display a corporate logo when you are hosting a networking event. You display it when you are pitching to an audience. The pieces click together in my mind with the lethal, heavy precision of a loaded chamber. The perfectly coordinated cream outfits. The carefully curated guest list that conveniently excluded the one person who knew the actual, disastrous financial numbers. The professional photographer capturing the corporate branding behind the smiling faces. This was not a dinner. This was a showcase. I stared at the glowing rectangle in my hand. For 34 years, I had played their rigged game. I had absorbed their subtle slights, swallowed their polite rejections, and meticulously covered their tracks. I had allowed myself to be the silent, dark vault for their worst secrets. Not anymore. I tapped the small speech bubble icon located directly beneath Marin's post. The digital keyboard appeared on my screen. My fingers did not shake. I did not draft a long, emotional paragraph detailing my hurt feelings or my broken heart. I did not hurl childish insults or use a single word of profanity. Emotional outbursts are too easily dismissed by people like my family as mere jealousy or mental instability. Cold facts, however, are immovable objects. I typed a single, concise sentence. Then the overdue taxes, insurance arrears, and bridge note are yours now. I hit send. The comment materialized immediately beneath Marin's toxic caption. It sat there, a stark, ugly line of black text against the pristine white background of the app. It was a digital live grenade rolled directly into the center of their carefully constructed cream-colored ballroom. I walked into my kitchen, placed the phone face up on the cool granite island, and poured myself a glass of water. I leaned against the counter and locked my eyes on the digital clock glowing on the microwave. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. 3. I took a slow sip of water. The silence of my apartment felt entirely different now. It was no longer the heavy silence of the excluded daughter. It was the tense, electric silence of the predator waiting in the brush. At exactly 7 minutes after I pressed send, I reached over and refreshed the post on my screen. The screen flashed gray, stuttered, and then reloaded. A small, automated error message popped up in the center of the display. This post is no longer available. Marin had deleted the picture. She did not just delete my comment to hide the stain, she nuked the entire post from the internet because she knew even a fraction of a second of public exposure was far too dangerous to risk. Less than 40 seconds later, my phone violently vibrated against the hard granite counter. The screen lit up the dark kitchen. It was my mother. The default ringtone blared through the quiet room, harsh, sudden, and demanding. I crossed my arms and watched it ring until the call finally rolled over to voicemail. Immediately, the phone began to ring again. This time, the caller ID displayed Marin's name. I let it ring. She called 3 separate times in rapid succession, the persistent buzzing acting as a digital manifestation of her rising, suffocating panic. Then, a third, entirely different name appeared on the glowing screen. Gavin Pike. My brother-in-law. I stared at his name with cold, clinical fascination. Gavin and I had not exchanged more than 20 words in the entire 5 years he had been legally married to my sister. He was a man who deliberately floated high above the family drama, perfectly happy to reap the vast social benefits of the Greenwood name without ever getting his hands dirty in the machinery. If Gavin was calling my personal cell phone at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night in the middle of a major social event, it meant my comment had not just ruined a pretty family photograph, it had struck a deep, structural nerve. It meant the panic had breached the inner circle of blood relatives and violently spilled over to the bystanders who had a vested interest in the illusion. Over the next 20 minutes, the phone lit up with 12 consecutive phone calls. Text messages began to flood the notification center, appearing in rapid-fire bursts of desperate damage control. Vivian, what are you doing right now? Take my call immediately. You are ruining the entire night. Please answer the phone. I did not touch the device. I stood motionless in the dim light of the kitchen, watching the small screen light up, vibrate furiously, go dark, and then immediately light up again. For the first time in my entire adult life, the deep, chronic ache of being cast aside was completely eradicated. The pain had passed through my system like a sudden, violent fever, breaking rapidly and leaving behind a chilling, absolute lucidity in its wake. The suffocating fog of familial obligation had vanished entirely. Before finally reaching over to press the button and power off the device, I looked at the dark reflection of my own face in the black glass of the microwave door. I thought about the exact wording of the comment I had left on that public page. I realized in that quiet, solitary moment exactly what I had accomplished. I had just effortlessly executed the one maneuver my family feared above all else in this world. I had dragged the ugly, unvarnished truth completely out of the shadows and placed it directly under the glaring, public lights before they had a single chance to put lipstick on it. They had spent their entire lives controlling the narrative, using my silence and my shame as their primary tool of manipulation. I just broke the tool. I woke up on Sunday morning with a completely clear head. The sudden rush of adrenaline from the night before had entirely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, mechanical focus. I did not bother making coffee or going for my usual morning run. I walked straight to my home office, sat down at my desk, and opened my laptop. It was time to systematically dismantle the life support machine I had been operating for nearly a decade. I logged into my primary personal banking portal. There, sitting quietly under the Recurring Transfers tab, was the automated mandate I had set up years ago. On the first day of every single month, a designated injection of $5,500 was routed directly from my savings into the Greenwood House main operating account. It was the invisible blood transfusion that kept their doors open, covered the minor vendor disputes, and paid the landscaping crew to keep the grounds looking pristine for the cameras. I clicked the button to cancel the series. The screen prompted me to confirm the cancellation. I clicked yes. I felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no hesitation, no sorrow, just the clean, precise satisfaction of closing a valve. Next, I tackled the digital infrastructure. For years, I had been the sole, unspoken administrator for every vendor portal, payroll system, and cloud storage drive associated with the venue. My family always claimed they were simply not good with technology. They said the numbers gave them migraines. It was easier if I just managed the logins. So, I took my administrative access and locked the doors from the outside. I changed the master password for the local property tax portal. I changed the security questions for the commercial hazard insurance account. I revoked the shared viewing permissions on the secure corporate drive where the tax filings and legal documents were housed. I replaced every single password with a randomized sequence of 24 characters. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the Greenwood family was officially locked out of their own financial nervous system. I anticipated an immediate, violent explosion. I expected my phone to ring off the hook by Monday morning when the caterers submitted their weekend invoices and the accounts bounced. Instead, there was a deafening, strategic silence. Monday passed. Tuesday and Wednesday followed without a single text message or phone call from my parents or my sister. It was a classic Greenwood maneuver. They were employing the silent treatment, treating my rebellion like a toddler throwing a temporary tantrum in a grocery store. They firmly believed that if they simply ignored me long enough, I would exhaust myself, feel appropriately guilty for my outburst, and quietly return to my designated post. They thought I was holding my breath. They had no idea I had already left the building by Friday afternoon. The reality of the locked accounts and the missing funds must have finally registered. Because the silence broke, my mother did not call me. She sent a text message. It arrived right as I was packing up my briefcase at the corporate office for the weekend. "You are making a mess out of something that was supposed to be a beautiful thing." I stared at the glowing screen. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. There was no mention of the money I had cut off. There was no acknowledgement of the locked digital portals, and certainly no apology for excluding me from the event. She was effortlessly claiming the moral high ground, framing my enforcement of basic boundaries as a malicious, vindictive act of sabotage against family harmony. Marin, predictably, opted for a far more public and performative strategy. On Saturday morning, my social media feed updated with a new temporary story from her account. It was a beautifully composed, desaturated photograph of a journal resting on a wooden table beside a cup of tea. The text overlaid on the image was carefully calculated. It is so heartbreaking when people use money to manipulate family. True love does not come with an invoice. Setting boundaries and protecting my peace from toxic energy today. I actually let out a sharp, dry laugh in my empty kitchen. She was brilliantly casting herself as the fragile victim of a controlling, financially abusive older sister. She was spinning a public narrative where my refusal to let them bleed me dry was somehow an attack on her innocence. She was insulating herself from the fallout before the first bounce check even hit the rumor mill. The collateral damage began rolling in by Sunday afternoon. 2 aunts and a cousin called me in rapid succession. I answered the first call out of sheer morbid curiosity. My aunt did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask if I was hurt by being deliberately excluded from a major milestone. She immediately launched into a breathless, heavily judgmental reprimand. Vivian, I simply do not understand why you felt the need to embarrass your parents so publicly on their special weekend. Could you not have handled your little financial squabble in private? Your mother is absolutely beside herself with grief over your behavior. I ended the call without responding. Sitting there with the dead phone in my hand, I realized a profound, immutable truth about the ecosystem I had grown up in. In a family that survives on an elaborate architecture of lies. The person who finally speaks the truth is never viewed as the savior. The truth teller is always branded as the villain who ruined the atmosphere. They did not care that my parents were drowning in debt. They only cared that I had forced everyone to look at the water. On Monday, I sat in the corporate cafeteria at Blackwater Freight Systems with June Mercer. I gave her a flat, chronological, entirely unembellished recounting of the weekend. I told her about the canceled wire transfers, the changed passwords, my mother's text message, Marin's digital martyrdom, and the flying monkeys my extended family had sent to harass me. June chewed her salad slowly, her eyes narrowing with sharp, analytical focus. They are reacting entirely too aggressively, June said, setting her plastic fork down on the table. If this were just about a bruised ego over a nasty comment on a photograph, they would just ice you out and complain about you behind your back. But Marin is setting up a proactive public defense strategy. Your mother is trying to make you feel guilty to regain immediate control, and they deployed the extended family to pressure you into compliance. They are mad because I cut off the cash flow, I replied, taking a sip of my sparkling water. They have vendor payments due on Wednesday. No, June countered, shaking her head firmly. They are panicking. You locked them out of the digital archives. Vivian, you took away their access to the historical paperwork. People do not orchestrate a synchronized smear campaign this quickly unless they are terrified of what you might find while you are poking around in the dark. You need to look closer. A reaction this volatile means they are hiding something much bigger than a tacky social media post. Her words hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. The cold, logical part of my brain, the part that investigated corporate liability for a living, immediately recognized that she was absolutely right. The math of their reaction did not add up to the size of my offense. Cutting off a monthly stipend would cause anger, perhaps a few screaming phone calls. But a coordinated, multi-front campaign to discredit my mental state and block my access. That was the behavior of a cornered animal trying to protect a massive vulnerability. I left the cafeteria, walked straight back to my office, and locked the door behind me. I pulled down the blinds. I woke up my desktop computer and pulled up the master financial folders on my secure external drive. I was no longer looking for validation, and I was certainly no longer preparing for a petty family argument. I was initiating a full, ruthless forensic audit. I started by pulling up every single old email thread with the estate's tax attorneys from the past 3 years. I downloaded 24 months of commercial bank statements from the operating accounts. I scrutinized the limited liability company charter, reading every single clause of the operating agreements I had drafted for them. Finally, I opened the digital folder containing our electronic signature histories. I spent 6 straight hours cross-referencing dates, internet protocol addresses, and document timestamps. I traced the flow of every dollar, every legal amendment, and every digital footprint. I was not looking for a mistake. I was searching for the exact anomaly I had been too blindly, foolishly loyal to see. I was determined to rip up the floorboards and find out exactly what kind of monster my family had buried underneath the foundation. The heavy, stiff cardboard envelope arrived via certified courier on a dreary Thursday afternoon. I had to physically sign for it at the reception desk of my corporate office. The return address, printed in stark black ink in the upper left corner, belonged to the Charleston County Recorder of Deeds. For a fleeting second, I assumed it was simply a routine municipal notice regarding the property taxes I had stubbornly refused to pay the previous week. I carried the rigid package back to my private office, locked the heavy glass door, and sliced the top open with a steel letter opener. I slid the stack of thick, watermarked legal paper out onto my desk. The very first page was a formalized notice of an updated operating agreement and an official transfer of membership interest for Greenwood Heritage Events Limited Liability Company. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the dense, boilerplate legal jargon until I reached the specific schedule of asset distribution. My breath hitched in my throat, freezing halfway down my windpipe. According to the notarized document resting under my hands, the 35% management equity stake I was verbally promised years ago, the exact equity stake that served as the unspoken collateral for my endless financial bailouts, had been completely liquidated. The shares had not been dissolved. They had been actively transferred exactly 3 weeks prior. The new, legally recognized beneficiaries of my 35% stake were Marin Greenwood and Gavin Pike. I sat utterly paralyzed, staring at the names printed in bold ink. I flipped to the second page, my hands suddenly moving with frantic, jerky precision. Attached to the county notice was the official exhibit of the transfer agreement. At the bottom of the final page, stark and undeniable, was my own electronic signature. It was a terrifyingly flawless execution. The document included the verified cryptographic hash, the exact timestamp down to the second, and the complete routing history. It looked absolutely legitimate, but as my eyes darted across the digital verification certificate, I noticed the anchor point. The entire electronic signing process had been routed through a dormant, archaic email address I had created for my mother over 4 years ago. It was a junk inbox I had set up solely to intercept spam from caterers and florists, an account I had not logged into for at least 18 months. They had resurrected a ghost account to digitally impersonate me. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a slow, heavy rhythm of rising dread. I turned to the third document in the stack, and the floor entirely dropped out from beneath me. It was a commercial personal guarantee contract. In my line of work as a senior contract risk manager, a personal guarantee is the ultimate, non-negotiable red flag. It is a legally binding iron chain. This specific document formally tied my personal name, my private assets, my corporate salary, and my immaculate credit score to a massive, multi-million-dollar commercial expansion loan for Greenwood House. It was a staggering line of new debt that I had absolutely zero prior knowledge of, completely unauthorized and fraudulently secured. If the estate defaulted on this massive new loan, the commercial bank would not just foreclose on the historic property in Charleston. They possessed the legal right to bypass the corporate shield entirely and come directly for my personal savings, my investments, and my future earnings. My family had chained me to the hull of a sinking ship and thrown the key into the ocean. The sheer breathtaking scale of the deception forced me to stand up from my leather chair. I paced the length of my office, the pieces of the puzzle violently snapping together with sickening clarity. The perfectly orchestrated anniversary dinner, the strategic, coordinated cream outfits, the professional photographer snapping high-resolution images, the elaborate, custom-made welcome board prominently displaying the corporate logo behind my smiling parents. It was never a sentimental celebration of 35 years of marriage. It was a sophisticated, highly choreographed investor showcase. The guests my mother had so carefully selected were not close family friends. They were wealthy marks. They were local venture capitalists, high net worth individuals, and commercial lenders. My parents had hosted a lavish networking event to secure funding for a massive expansion project. They had proudly introduced Maren and Gavin to the wealthy crowd as the vibrant, youthful new succession team poised to take over the historic estate. And they had managed to secure the underlying financing for the entire charade by secretly using my forged signature as the ultimate, invisible safety net. I walked back to my desk, my mind operating with cold, lethal speed. I needed absolute proof. I needed the smoking gun before I made my next move. I opened my laptop and bypassed my work network, logging directly into the administrative portal of the electronic signature software provider. Because I was still the master account holder for the corporate billing, I had high-level access to the security logs. I requested a full forensic audit trail for the specific document identification number listed on the fraudulent transfer agreement. The digital system whirred for a few seconds before generating a comprehensive, line-by-line security report. I scrolled past the dates and the timestamps until I found the exact Internet protocol address that had initiated and finalized the forged signature. I copied the string of numbers and ran it through a basic geolocation tracker. The red pin dropped onto the digital map with brutal, unarguable accuracy. The digital footprint did not originate from my apartment in Raleigh. It did not originate from a random coffee shop. The signature had been executed on a desktop computer, permanently hardwired into the primary administrative office located on the first floor of Greenwood House. A profound, icy calm washed over my entire body, extinguishing the last remaining embers of familial obligation I held in my heart. The blatant forgery was a devastating betrayal. But the sheer calculated premeditation of the timeline was what truly chilled the blood in my veins. I finally understood the actual architecture of my exclusion. I understood the real reason behind my mother's sweet, apologetic phone call exactly 1 week before the party. It had absolutely nothing to do with limited seating on a river terrace. It had nothing to do with curating a stress-free environment. And it certainly had nothing to do with my aesthetic incompatibility with their cream-colored wardrobe. They absolutely had to eliminate me from the guest list because my presence was an uncontainable liability. They could not risk me walking into my own family home, seeing the glossy investor pitch materials scattered on the cocktail tables, and listening to my father publicly announce Maren and Gavin as the new majority stakeholders of an entity I was secretly funding. They needed me blind, deaf, and entirely removed from the premises so they could execute their hostile takeover right in the middle of the ballroom without me stepping up to the microphone and halting the fraud in its tracks. I sat back down in my chair, the silence of my office pressing in around me. The stack of legal documents lay scattered across the polished mahogany wood like the chalk outline of a murder scene. The photograph Maren had posted on social media was not merely a petty, vindictive insult designed to make me feel small. It was the velvet theater curtain dropping over a massive financial crime, up until this exact second. My primary objective had been simple self-preservation. I had wanted nothing more than to cut the financial cords, lock the digital gates, and retreat into my own quiet life. I had been willing to let them keep the illusion as long as I could finally protect my own peace. But looking down at my forged signature, looking at the legal trap they had meticulously built to enslave my future to their failures, the entire paradigm shattered. They had not just taken my money and discarded my feelings. They had deliberately weaponized my identity to fund their delusions of grandeur. From that precise moment forward, my motivation permanently mutated. I was no longer interested in retreating. I was no longer interested in defending myself from their emotional manipulation. I was going to launch a catastrophic counteroffensive, and I was going to burn their beautiful, cream-colored illusions straight to the ground to rip my name off their fraudulent debt. I did not waste time weeping over the shattered remains of my family tree. I treated the situation exactly as I would handle a catastrophic vendor breach at Blackwater Freight Systems. I compartmentalized the emotional damage, locked it away in a dark corner of my mind, and immediately sought out a mercenary. By Monday morning, I was sitting across a vast mahogany desk from Tessa Vale. Tessa was a senior litigator specializing in high-net-worth property disputes and complex financial fraud. She operated out of a sleek, minimalist office in downtown Raleigh, and she possessed a reputation for being entirely unimpressed by legacy surnames and country club pedigrees. People hired Tessa when they wanted to quietly dismantle their wealthy relatives without leaving any usable wreckage behind. She did not offer me a tissue when I sat down. She offered me a legal pad and a pen. I laid the stack of documents on her desk. The forged transfer of my 35% equity, the personal guarantee tying me to the massive commercial loan, the Internet Protocol address logs, and the chronological history of my canceled wire transfers. Tessa put on a pair of tortoiseshell reading glasses and read through the entire stack in absolute silence. The only sound in the room was the crisp turning of pages and the faint hum of the city traffic 14 stories below. When she finally removed her glasses, her expression was devoid of any sympathetic pity. It was the sharp, calculating look of a predator evaluating the weak points of its prey. Let us be absolutely clear about what we are looking at. Vivian, Tessa said, her voice a low, commanding register. This is no longer a messy bloodline dispute. This is not a misunderstanding over dinner invitations. This is systemic, premeditated forgery. It is a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty. And, given the nature of the commercial loan attached to this forged guarantee, we are looking at federal wire fraud and potential investor deception. Hearing a seasoned litigator categorize my parents as perpetrators of federal fraud did not cause me to flinch. It validated the cold, mechanical hum that had taken over my nervous system. I need to know exactly how they built the trap, I replied, leaning forward in the leather guest chair. I need to map the entire sequence of events so I know exactly where to apply the pressure. For the next 4 hours, Tessa and I turned her glass conference table into a forensic autopsy. We pinned down every single moving part of the conspiracy, establishing a timeline that proved the anniversary dinner was merely the final act of a play they had been rehearsing for months. The first major breakthrough came when Tessa subpoenaed the digital communication logs from the venue's master server. Buried in the sent folders of my mother's administrative account was a heavily designed, glossy promotional email. It had been blasted out to a highly curated list of very important guests, the local investors, the bank executives, and the prominent socialites exactly 14 days before my mother called to uninvite me. The email subject line heralded a new era for Greenwood House. The body paragraph explicitly described the estate as transitioning into its next generation under the exclusive, dynamic management of Maren Greenwood and her husband. I stared at the printed copy of that email until the letters blurred. The narrative had been written, polished, and distributed 2 full weeks before they told me they simply lacked the seating on the river terrace. They needed me out of the picture because they had already sold my equity to the highest bidder in their social circle. The second revelation was even uglier. Tessa forced a preliminary discovery request on the commercial lender who had issued the new expansion loan. The glossy brochures promised a new pavilion and restored grounds. But the bank records pointed to something far more desperate. The money was not building the future. It was being used to keep an already failing business alive. But the most devastating piece of evidence did not involve the missing money or the glossy marketing lies. It involved a single, scrawled signature on the internal verification line of the fraudulent equity transfer document. In the state of South Carolina, an internal transfer of limited liability equity requires a witnessing signature from an active, managing member of the corporation to verify the identity of the person relinquishing their shares. On the bottom left corner of the forged document, directly beneath my digitally cloned signature, was a physical signature written in blue ink. It belonged to Patrick Greenwood. I picked up the piece of paper, my hands perfectly steady, but a deep, hollow chasm opened up in the center of my chest. My father, the quiet, gentle man who had spent his entire life hiding behind thick biographies in his study to avoid conflict. The man who always played the role of the oblivious, innocent bystander whenever my mother and Marin orchestrated their emotional manipulations. I had spent 34 years believing he was simply too weak or too detached to intervene. I was so incredibly wrong. When his own comfort was genuinely threatened. When the walls of his historic estate were finally closing in. The man who spent decades avoiding confrontation suddenly found the proactive energy to actively participate in my financial execution. He did not just look the other way while they stole my equity. He picked up a pen and legally notarized the theft. He looked at a document transferring my life's work to my spoiled sister, knowing full well I had never agreed to it, and he signed his name to validate the lie. That single line of blue ink hurt infinitely more than the forged electronic signature. It killed the last surviving microscopic fraction of hope I had harbored for a father who actually loved me. I placed the paper back on the glass table. "I want to file the injunction tomorrow," I said, my voice completely stripped of any human warmth. "I want to freeze their accounts and drag every single one of them into a deposition room." Tessa raised a hand, her dark eyes locking onto mine. "No, not yet." I frowned, a spark of genuine irritation flaring in my chest. "They are actively spending the fraudulent loan money. Tessa, every day we wait, they burn through more of the capital tied to my name. And every day we wait, they continue to operate under the assumption that they have successfully gotten away with it." Tessa countered smoothly, leaning back in her chair. "Right now, they think you are just a disgruntled daughter throwing a silent temper tantrum because you got locked out of a party. They have no idea you hold the architectural blueprints to their fraud. If we strike right now, they will scramble. They will hire aggressive defense counsel. They will destroy the hard drives. And they will coordinate their stories to frame this as a simple administrative error or a family misunderstanding." She tapped her pen against the legal pad, her mind already 3 steps ahead of the board. "We need to let them get comfortable in their lie. We need to wait until they make their first official move to leverage that forged equity. The moment they submit those falsified documents to a second bank, or try to officially draw down the next tranche of the construction loan using your guarantee. The crime elevates from a private dispute to a highly visible, undeniable federal offense. We give them enough rope to hang themselves entirely, and then we kick the chair out from underneath them." I sat in silence, digesting the brutal, immaculate logic of her strategy. All my life, my quietness had reflected how I gave in. I had held back my words just to avoid conflict. I had remained silent to endure their harshness. I had dimmed my own presence to make things easier for them. But as I looked at the undeniable evidence of their betrayal scattered across the glass table, the nature of my silence fundamentally changed. It was no longer a shield I used to protect myself from their cruelty. It was a weapon I was quietly sharpening in the dark. "Fine," I said softly, meeting Tessa's gaze with a cold, unyielding stare. "We wait. Let them keep talking." For the first time in 34 years, my silence was not a surrender. It was the countdown to their absolute destruction. It took exactly 5 days for the digital tripwire to snap when Tessa and I initiated the forensic audit of the electronic signature portal. An automated security notification bounced directly to the archaic email address my family had resurrected to execute their forgery. The illusion of my quiet submission evaporated the moment that digital alert landed in their inbox. They realized with absolute certainty that I was not merely ignoring their phone calls out of hurt feelings. I was actively pulling up the floorboards to expose exactly what they had buried beneath the foundation. My mother did not send a passive text message this time. She called and left a perfectly modulated, deeply serious voicemail demanding we meet in person to resolve a minor administrative misunderstanding like adults. She chose the location with surgical, strategic precision. It was a dark, unremarkable seafood bistro located 40 miles outside the Charleston city limits. It was an establishment entirely devoid of crystal chandeliers, valet parking, or any trace of elegance. It was completely off the radar of their wealthy country club social circle. They desperately needed a highly controlled environment where no familiar eyes could witness the dirty work of securing their theft. I arrived at the restaurant precisely on time. The air inside smelled faintly of stale frying oil and old lemon wedges. Marin was already seated in a dim corner booth, sipping a glass of sparkling water. She wore an expression of deep, practiced concern, her brow furrowed in a perfect imitation of familial empathy. She looked exactly like a grief counselor preparing to stage a psychological intervention for a highly unstable patient. My father sat rigidly next to her, staring fixedly at the condensation gathering on the outside of his water glass. He did not look up when I approached the table. He did not acknowledge my presence in any way. His absolute silence made the air in the booth feel incredibly thick, suffocating beneath the heavy weight of his chronic cowardice. My mother arrived 2 minutes later. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blazer, but the rigid tightness around her mouth betrayed her internal panic. She did not bother with the standard pleasantries or menus. She slid into the booth opposite me, reached into her oversized designer tote bag, and produced a thick manila envelope. She placed it on the scratched wooden table and slowly pushed a new stack of stapled documents toward me. "We just want to fix this ugly little mess and move forward," my mother said, her voice dropping to a soft, conspiratorial whisper. "We need to keep the property safe and ensure the business remains strictly within the right bloodline. You have always been so sensible about these things. We have drawn up a peaceful solution." I looked down at the freshly printed papers. The header of the document was unmistakable. It was a legally binding confirmation of voluntary transfer. They were actually asking me to retroactively sign away the equity they had already stolen from me. "If you simply sign this confirmation, acknowledging that you willingly surrendered your shares to Marin and Gavin, we will work closely with the commercial bank to eventually remove your name from the personal guarantee," my mother explained, her tone dripping with fake benevolence. "We just need to formalize the paperwork so the expansion loan can clear the final underwriting process smoothly without any unnecessary delays." Tessa had accurately predicted this exact, desperate maneuver. The moment they realized I was hunting for the digital footprint, their only viable defense strategy was to strong-arm me into legally sanitizing the crime myself. Before I drove down to the restaurant, Tessa had firmly reminded me of the state legal statutes. South Carolina is a one-party consent state regarding the recording of private conversations. Deep inside the pocket of my wool blazer, my mobile phone was actively and quietly capturing every single syllable spoken at that table. I kept my hands neatly folded in my lap. I did not raise my voice, and I did not reach for the expensive pen my mother was subtly nudging across the scratched wood. I just watched them and started posing brief, detached questions, allowing them complete space to expose themselves through what they said. "Why did you need my equity to secure the new loan?" I asked, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. Marin leaned forward, placing a manicured hand over her collarbone in a gesture of profound condescension. "You have your own corporate career up in the city. You do not even use the place. You should be happy your name is still useful to the people who actually love this family and want to see the estate thrive." I stared at my younger sister. She had not yelled. She had not insulted my appearance or my personality. Yet, that single, casually delivered sentence was the most violently offensive thing she had ever said to me. It perfectly and effortlessly summarized my entire existence within the Greenwood family hierarchy. I was not a human being with a life, a future, or a soul. I was a utility. I was a tool that had outlived its primary function, and was now expected to be grateful that they could still find a way to extract value from my hollowed-out identity. I shifted my gaze away from Marin and locked eyes with my mother, who accessed my digital signature account on the desktop computer inside the venue office. My mother's confident facade flickered for a fraction of a second. She quickly smoothed her features into a mask of maternal disappointment, entirely deflecting the accusation. We all have to make difficult sacrifices to keep the legacy intact for the family. You are completely missing the bigger picture here. We were trying to protect you from the stress of the aggressive bank negotiations. It was an executive decision made for the greater good of the household. A forgery is not an executive decision, I replied evenly. It is a felony. The word dropped onto the table like a lead weight. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the terrifying reality of what I had just said. Then, the most surprising thing of the entire evening occurred. My father, the man who had spent his entire adult life blending into the wallpaper whenever a conflict arose, finally lifted his head. His face was flushed with a sudden, defensive anger. He glared at me across the table, his gentle persona completely vanishing. "You are making way too big a deal out of this," my father snapped, his voice rough with intense irritation. "We are offering you a clean way out. Stop being so incredibly stubborn and just sign the paper so we can all go home." I looked at the man who had helped create me. For years, I had made endless excuses for his passivity. I had convinced myself that he was simply a gentle soul trapped in the gravitational pull of my mother's overwhelming ambition. I had believed he was blind to the financial and emotional exploitation. But in that small, dimly lit restaurant, his sharp rebuke provided the exact confirmation I needed. He was not clueless. He was not a helpless victim. He understood exactly what they had done to me. And he fully supported the massive theft because it guaranteed his own continued comfort and social standing. He simply chose the winning side. The last lingering thread of familial loyalty inside my chest snapped cleanly in half. There was absolutely nothing left to mourn. I stood up from the booth. I did not touch the voluntary transfer documents. I did not touch the pen. I reached into my purse, pulled out a $50 bill, and dropped it onto the center of the table to cover the untouched sparkling waters. My mother looked up at me, her eyes widening in genuine alarm as she finally realized her psychological trap had completely failed. "Where do you think you are going? Sit back down." "We are not finished here." I looked down at the three of them, sitting shoulder to shoulder in their desperate, crumbling alliance. I felt a profound, intoxicating sense of liberation wash over my entire body. They possessed absolutely no power over me anymore. Their guilt trips were entirely useless. Their subtle threats were completely empty. They had brought me to this dark little room to secure my final surrender. But they had only succeeded in providing the exact piece of audio evidence Tessa and I required to seal their coffins. "We are completely finished," I said, my voice cutting through the stale air with the cold, unyielding edge of a steel blade. "From now on, anything you have to say to me goes through my lawyer." I turned my back on them and walked out the door. Stepping into the cool night air and leaving the entire Greenwood legacy sitting at a sticky wooden table with a stack of unsigned confessions. On Monday morning, Tessa unleashed the hounds. It was not a quiet, internal legal maneuver. It was a scorched earth campaign designed to hit my family exactly where they derived all their power, their public reputation, and their credit line. Tessa dispatched formal notices of dispute to the commercial bank holding the fraudulent guarantee, the Electronic Signature Corporation, and the Charleston County Recorder of Deeds. But the most devastating envelopes were hand-delivered to the three primary angel investors my parents had actively courted at the anniversary dinner. Tessa did not accuse my family of fraud in those letters. She simply attached a copy of my filed injunction and formally advised them that the equity structure of the limited liability company was currently under severe legal dispute regarding forged authorization. Wealthy people do not like messy legal entanglements. Within 48 hours of receiving Tessa's notice, the dominoes began to fall. The most lucrative potential partners, a married couple who owned a highly successful chain of upscale coastal restaurants, immediately formally withdrew their letter of intent. They cited unacceptable liability risks. Their sudden exit triggered a catastrophic chain reaction down in Charleston, without their initial capital injection. Greenwood House completely missed the deadline to secure the heavy machinery for the new pavilion. By Wednesday afternoon, the primary contractor pulled his crew off the property. The construction site sat eerily silent. Nothing but half-dug trenches and abandoned equipment. Inside the grand house, the meticulously maintained facade began to crack, without the bridge loan funds I used to quietly supply every month. And with the bank freezing the new expansion account pending a fraud investigation. The cash flow dried up instantly. Whispers started echoing through the staff hallways. The florists were demanding cash on delivery. The catering staff were nervously gossiping about delayed payroll checks. The polished, affluent illusion was rapidly dissolving into the reality of a bankrupt operation. The crumbling facade did something I had not anticipated. It brought a ghost out of the woodwork. On Thursday evening, I received a direct message on my professional networking profile from Leah Sutter. Leah was the former lead event coordinator for the family business. She had abruptly quit 2 months ago, citing irreconcilable differences with my mother's management style. "I heard about the construction halting and the bank freeze," Leah wrote. "I think you and I need to have a conversation about what really happened after the regular guests went home on the night of the anniversary." We met for coffee the next morning. Leah slid a heavy manila folder across the table. It did not contain legal documents. It contained the undeniable anatomy of a premeditated corporate pitch. "Your mother made us draft 2 completely different schedules for that night," Leah explained, tapping the thick folder. "The first was the sentimental family dinner for the wider circle. But after 9 o'clock in the evening, once the relatives and the casual friends were ushered out, they reset the conservatory. They brought in a projector, premium liquor, and a select group of 12 high-net-worth individuals." I opened the folder. Inside was the official, printed run-of-show document. It explicitly detailed a 30-minute presentation titled "The Next Generation of Greenwood Heritage," featuring Maren and Gavin as the sole managing directors. Leah also provided several candid, behind-the-scenes photographs she had snapped on her phone to document the room setup. The images clearly showed my sister standing at a podium, pointing to architectural renderings of the new pavilion, actively soliciting capital using my stolen equity as her personal collateral. It was the final nail in the coffin. The anniversary party had been engineered as a private investor pitch, with the family dinner serving as cover. Down in Charleston, the panic morphed into absolute hysteria. Maren realized the narrative was slipping rapidly out of her perfectly manicured hands. She resorted to the only defense mechanism she truly understood: high school social warfare. She began aggressively calling every single aunt, uncle, and cousin in our extended family network. She tried to spin my legal injunction as the bitter, vindictive rampage of a jealous older sister. She is just furious because Mom and Dad never chose her to be the face of the brand. Maren wept to my aunt on the phone. A conversation that was immediately relayed back to me by a deeply uncomfortable cousin. "She is trying to destroy our parents' legacy just to punish me for being the favorite." But the strategy catastrophically backfired. The extended family might have been willfully blind to the financial mechanics of the estate, but they were not entirely stupid. Maren's hysterical victim routine suddenly rang incredibly hollow when the contractors walked off the job and the venue started missing payroll. A few of the older, more observant relatives suddenly remembered who had actually been quietly paying the property taxes 3 years ago. They remembered who had handled the aggressive debt collectors when my father was conveniently hiding in his study. Maren's attempt to paint me as a jealous pariah only highlighted the glaring, uncomfortable truth that I was the only person who had ever kept the roof over their heads. My mother, realizing that controlling the family was no longer sufficient to stop the bleeding, decided to attack my professional perimeter. She somehow acquired the direct office line for June Mercer on Friday afternoon. While I was sitting in a risk assessment meeting, Colleen called June under the guise of maternal concern. She tried to play the role of the worried, heartbroken mother, desperately fishing for any information regarding my mental state or my legal strategy. "I am just so incredibly worried about her," my mother purred through the phone line. "She is acting completely out of character. Has she been under a lot of stress at the corporate office lately? I just want to know if she is having some sort of emotional breakdown." June did not entertain the performance for a single second. "Mrs. Greenwood," June replied, her voice dropping to a tone of absolute, freezing professionalism. "I am her colleague, not her therapist. But I can assure you, she is operating with more clarity and precision right now than I have ever seen from anyone in my entire career. Do not ever call this number again." June immediately hung up and walked straight into my office to report the conversation. Hearing how effortlessly June had shut the door in my mother's face triggered a profound, quiet shift inside my chest. For decades, I had allowed the biological accident of shared DNA to define my concept of loyalty. I had let the title of family bind me to people who actively consumed me. But sitting across from June, a woman who possessed absolutely no blood obligation to me whatsoever, yet defended my boundaries with fierce, uncompromising loyalty, the distinction became crystal clear. I finally saw the massive, unbridgeable canyon between a genuine family and people who merely share your genetics. By the time the weekend arrived, the entire atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The suffocating, oppressive weight of their collective judgment had completely lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in my life, the gravitational pull of the Greenwood family dynamic was no longer dictating my movements. The space of the conflict had violently expanded beyond the dark, sticky tables of cheap seafood restaurants, and the manipulative confines of private text messages. It was out in the open, breathing the harsh, unforgiving oxygen of the real world. I sat in my apartment, watching the Raleigh city lights blink against the twilight sky. I had not raised my voice. I had not posted a single tearful video on the internet. I had not engaged in a single screaming match. The power had subtly but permanently shifted into my hands, not because I was the loudest person in the room, but because the undeniable, ugly truth finally had a vast, unforgiving audience. The subpoenaed financial records arrived in Tessa's secure digital portal on a Tuesday morning. Until that moment, the entire conflict had been fought in the abstract realm of stolen equity and forged signatures. But the raw, unredacted corporate ledgers dragged the betrayal out of the shadows and placed it under the harsh, blinding fluorescent lights of an autopsy table. Tessa granted me access to the files, and I spent the entire night sitting in my home office, dissecting the true anatomy of my family's survival. What I unearthed was infinitely dirtier and far more parasitic than I had ever imagined. They were not merely incompetent business owners suffering from a stroke of bad luck. They were operating a terminal system that relied entirely on using me as a human shock absorber for their grotesque financial negligence. I opened the master ledger for the newly acquired commercial loan. According to the glossy brochures my parents had distributed to the wealthy investors, that massive influx of capital was strictly earmarked for future growth. It was supposed to fund the construction of a beautiful new outdoor pavilion and upgrade the historical landscaping. I followed the digital trail of the disbursed funds, and the narrative of a bright, expanding future instantly collapsed. The money had never even touched a construction escrow account. Instead, the loan acted as a desperate, emergency blood transfusion for a business that was actively hemorrhaging cash. I found a staggering sequence of outgoing wire transfers used to silently issue refunds to furious clients who had canceled their wedding contracts after my mother failed to secure the proper municipal permits. I uncovered tens of thousands of dollars paid directly to the county to settle severe safety and fire code violations that my parents had willfully ignored for over 2 years. Then, my eyes locked onto a specific sequence of payments that made the air in my office turn freezing cold. The loan funds, backed entirely by my stolen equity and my forged personal guarantee, had been used to pay off a heavily overdrawn corporate credit card. I pulled the specific statement for that card and found a horrifying itemized list of luxury expenses: high-end golf club memberships, imported wine deliveries, and extravagant coastal resort vacations. The name embossed on the front of that corporate card belonged to Gavin Pike. My brother-in-law had been living like a millionaire on a line of credit that was ultimately tethered to my personal savings, and my parents had authorized the theft to keep the illusion of his success intact. They were not expanding because they possessed a brilliant vision for the future. They were expanding because they were drowning in a sea of toxic debt, and they desperately needed a compelling, beautiful story to cover up the ugly reality of their sinking ship. But the ledger contained an even darker secret, one that fundamentally destroyed the very last shred of empathy I held for my younger sister. Buried deep within the operating expenses, categorized vaguely under external marketing services, was a massive, 6-figure outgoing wire transfer. It was labeled as a consulting fee. I traced the routing number. The money had been deposited directly into the primary business account of a boutique public relations firm owned and operated exclusively by Maren Greenwood. The transfer had been executed exactly 4 days after the anniversary party. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen as a wave of profound, sickening clarity washed over me. For my entire life, I had viewed Maren through a specific, somewhat forgiving lens. I believed she was merely a spoiled, deeply entitled golden child who passively absorbed the benefits of our parents' favoritism. I thought she was simply too selfish and too insulated to understand the damage she caused. The ledger proved me entirely wrong. Maren was not a passive beneficiary. She was a highly active, heavily compensated conspirator. She had not just happily accepted the stolen equity, she had directly charged our parents a massive premium to help them execute the fraud. She had monetized my erasure. She had drafted the press releases, curated the investor guest list, and designed the physical stage where my identity was auctioned off. And she had demanded a massive cash payout for her services, as if the financial revelations were not damning enough. The psychological reality of their betrayal was brutally reinforced the following afternoon. Leah Sutter, the former event manager, sent me a final batch of digital evidence. It was a series of screen captures from a private group messaging thread between my mother and the venue's security team, time-stamped just hours before the anniversary party began. I opened the image files on my phone. The instructions from Colleen Greenwood were typed in sharp, commanding capitalization. Under no circumstances is Vivian to be granted access to the main house tonight. If she arrives, turn her away at the front gate. She asks the wrong questions at the wrong time. Keep her out. I read the words until they burned themselves into my retinas. The entire story snapped into brutal focus. The polite phone call about limited seating, the gentle excuses about wanting a stress-free environment, the delicate implication that I simply did not fit the joyful aesthetic of the evening. It was all a meticulously constructed lie. They did not exclude me because they were afraid I would ruin the mood or because I was too serious for a party. They locked the gates because I was the only person on earth who possessed the analytical capability to stand in the middle of that ballroom, look at their investor pitch, and instantly dismantle their entire fraud. They knew I could read the hidden numbers behind their perfectly tailored suits. They shut me out because I was the only person who could expose the truth before the room finished applauding. The deeper I dug into the rot, the more my father attempted to breach my defenses. As Tessa filed the initial discovery motions and the legal pressure began to suffocate the venue. Patrick Greenwood's panic manifested in a relentless barrage of text messages. He sent them late at night, his words a pathetic mixture of begging and demanding. "You are destroying your own blood. We need to handle this as a family. Stop dragging lawyers into our home. Please, Vivian. I am your father. You cannot do this to us." I read every single message as it arrived. I noted the precise, cowardly language he employed. Not once in his endless stream of digital pleading did he ever use the word forgery. He never mentioned the stolen shares, the unauthorized credit lines, or his own physical signature on the fraudulent documents. He completely refused to acknowledge his specific, criminal actions. He only cared about the consequences of those actions, desperately weaponizing the concept of family to shield himself from the fallout. I did not reply to a single text. I simply forwarded screenshots of his messages to Tessa to add to the harassment file. There was no longer any path back to the woman I used to be. The dutiful, silent daughter who absorbed their financial blows was dead and buried. On Friday morning, I walked into Tessa's office and authorized the most devastating legal strike available in our arsenal. I instructed her to file for an emergency binding injunction against Greenwood Heritage Events Limited Liability Company. It was a comprehensive cease and desist order that completely and permanently legally barred them from utilizing my name, my stolen equity, or my credit profile in any capacity on any future fundraising documents, bank applications, or investor pitches. It was the equivalent of pouring concrete into the engines of their sinking ship. It guaranteed their absolute financial paralysis. Tessa drafted the motion with ruthless efficiency before she hit the button to officially file the document with the state court. She looked across the desk at me, her expression deadly serious. "Once this injunction hits the public docket, the blast radius is going to be massive," Tessa warned, her voice steady and low. "The local business journals will pick it up. Your parents will undoubtedly run to their social circles and try to paint you as a mentally unstable, vindictive child who is trying to ruin their legacy out of sheer spite. The upcoming preliminary hearing is going to dictate exactly who controls the narrative in the public eye. You need to be prepared for a vicious smear campaign." I looked at the thick stack of financial autopsies, the forged signatures, and the undeniable proof of their parasitism resting on the glass table. I felt an absolute, terrifying calm settle deep inside my bones. "I do not need the public on my side," I replied, my voice carrying the cold, immovable weight of a falling guillotine. "I just need the record on the side of the truth." The civil hearing took place on a rainy Tuesday morning inside a sterile, glass-walled conference room at a neutral arbitration firm in downtown Charleston. This was not a sweeping river terrace. It was not a setting where my family could hide behind crystal champagne flutes, string lights, or upper-class charm. It was a mandatory settlement conference. Present at the long oak table were the senior loan officers from the commercial bank, the two remaining local investors who had not yet formally fled the project, the opposing legal counsel, Tessa, and myself. My family arrived 15 minutes late, a classic power play that fell completely flat in the harsh fluorescent lighting. My mother walked in wearing a tailored ivory suit, her hair perfectly coiffed, her chin held high as if she still genuinely believed she could win this battle purely on aesthetics and polite smiles. Marin trailed behind her, her face set in a rigid, cold mask, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. But it was my father who truly caught my attention. Patrick Greenwood looked as though he had aged 10 years in the span of a few weeks. His shoulders sagged beneath his expensive wool coat, and his eyes darted nervously around the room, for the first time in his entire life. His curated ignorance could not protect him from the impending consequences. The opposing counsel, a loud, aggressive man hired to bully us into submission, opened the floor by attempting to frame the entire situation as a simple, unfortunate administrative oversight between relatives. He spoke for 3 minutes before Tessa calmly raised her hand and shut him down. Tessa did not yell. She did not perform for the audience. She simply opened her thick leather binder and began to methodically dismantle their lives. She presented the chain of evidence in a chronological, undeniable sequence. She slid copies of the Internet Protocol login history across the table, showing exactly when and where the electronic signature was forged inside the venue property. She distributed the time-stamped transfer documents alongside the internal run-of-show schedule for the anniversary party, proving the succession announcement was planned while my name was still legally bound to the debt. She handed the bank executives the printed text messages, proving I was explicitly banned from the premises to prevent me from stopping the presentation. Then, she laid out the internal financial audits, detailing the misallocated funds, the safety violation fines, and the luxury credit card expenses. The bank executives stopped taking notes. They stared at the documents in stunned, heavy silence. The opposing counsel cleared his throat, his aggressive posture visibly deflating. He stammered, attempting to argue that while the paperwork was sloppy, the verbal intent of the family was always to restructure the business, and that I had implicitly agreed to help them. That was the exact moment Tessa played our final card. She reached into her briefcase, pulled out a small digital audio recorder, placed it in the center of the oak table, and pressed play. The crisp, clear audio from the dark seafood bistro filled the sterile conference room. Everyone sitting at the table heard Marin's sharp, condescending voice state clearly that I did not even use the venue and that I should be happy my name was still useful. They heard me ask about the forged digital signature, and then they heard the unmistakable, gruff voice of Patrick Greenwood demanding I stop making a big deal out of it and simply sign the paper to retroactively legitimize the theft. The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. It was the sound of their legacy collapsing in real time. The two local investors stood up from their leather chairs, packed their briefcases without uttering a single word, and walked out the glass doors. The senior loan officer from the commercial bank turned to the opposing counsel, his face flushed with professional rage. He announced formally that the bank was immediately freezing all remaining capital disbursements and transferring the entire Greenwood House portfolio directly to their internal federal fraud investigation unit. The opposing counsel practically collapsed into his chair. His aggressive demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by a desperate, panicked plea to open settlement negotiations immediately to avoid federal indictments. My mother finally broke. The polished ivory suit and the perfectly coiffed hair could no longer hold the illusion together. She buried her face in her hands and began to weep violently. But sitting directly across from her, watching her shoulders shake, I felt absolutely no pity. I knew exactly what those tears were. She was not crying out of maternal remorse. She was not weeping because she had deeply betrayed her eldest daughter. She was crying because she had definitively, publicly lost control of the narrative. She lifted her tear-streaked face, pointing a shaking finger across the oak table at me. "You are destroying this family," she sobbed, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "You are tearing us apart," for the first time since I walked into the room. I spoke. I looked directly into her eyes, my voice carrying the absolute, unshakable weight of the truth. The family ended the exact moment you decided you needed my name more than you needed me. The preliminary legal decisions came down swiftly and mercilessly. The arbitrator officially recognized the transfer of my 35% equity stake as entirely fraudulent and legally void, because the foundational equity transfer was ruled invalid. The massive commercial personal guarantee attached to my name was immediately canceled and shredded. Furthermore, the ruling granted me the explicit legal right to file a separate civil lawsuit for full financial restitution regarding the specific funds misappropriated under my forged identity. Greenwood House fell into immediate, Catastrophic forced restructuring. Without my credit line and my stolen equity acting as a shield, the bank seized operational control. Marin was instantly stripped of all management authority. Gavin was pulled into a severe, forensic financial investigation regarding his corporate credit card abuse. My father was legally compelled to sign a sworn, public affidavit admitting his direct role in witnessing and validating the forged documents, forever ruining his reputation as the innocent, mild-mannered patriarch. And my mother was left standing in the ruins of her beloved estate, with no stage left to tell her beautiful, fabricated versions of reality. 6 months later, the dust finally settled. I utilized the initial financial settlement I recovered from the estate to place a substantial down payment on a beautiful, historic brick townhouse in Durham. I continued my work as a senior risk manager at Blackwater Freight Systems, having surgically severed every single financial, legal, and emotional tie to the Greenwood name. I walked away from the wreckage carrying only one absolute, unbreakable lesson: genuine love is never proven by allowing other people to consume your life. The final chapter of this story does not end with a photograph posted for public consumption. It ends on a quiet Tuesday evening in late October. I am standing alone in the center of my new kitchen. The countertops are a dark, unpolished slate. There are no expensive string lights glowing in the background. There are no coordinating cream-colored outfits, no crystal champagne flutes, and no carefully crafted, toxic captions. There is only me, drinking a glass of water in the quiet peace of a home I bought with my own honest money. And for the very first time in my entire life, I look around my space and realize I have not been cut out of the frame. I am exactly where I belong, and the picture is finally perfect. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so more listeners can find the channel.